Welcome to Accounting Life with Jotham Ty. Our guest today is Senad Mustafic, Chief Accounting Officer at 1Password. In this episode, we explore the evolving landscape of work environments in the accounting profession. From fully remote setups to hybrid and traditional in-office models, we discuss the pros and cons of each approach. Now, our host, Jotham Ty.
Hey, Senad, welcome back to the Accounting Live podcast. How you been?
Hey, Jotham, pleasure to be back. Good to see you. Been pretty good. How about yourself?
Pretty good. We're restarting the season, and you're one of the first guests that I thought about for this episode because this topic, and we've had really good conversations in the past about talent management, recruiting, and obviously with the subject of remote work, hybrid, and so on, that is on top of a lot of accounting leaders' minds. And I'm sure things were very different when you and I first started our careers. Things have now shifted to more of hybrid, and in some cases, remote work. So I wanted to get your perspectives on that. And I think you're specifically a great guest for this because the company that you're in now, you mentioned to me, has been fully remote since inception. So I'm really excited to dig in.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to talk about the topic. It can sometimes feel controversial as people have various different points of view on this, but I'm happy to dive in and chat through it.
Well, I'm no politician, Sanad, but I do agree with the general sentiment that people have different perspectives. There's no like one universal black and white answer, and I think each situation just has different ways of looking at things, such as like just like everything else in life. But nonetheless, I think it's always helpful for our audience to hear like specific ways of doing things in case there are elements there that one can take back and apply to their own organizations. And because we are called the Accounting Live podcast, I wanted to like laser in with my question specifically on that particular function. So to kick things off, Sanad, how do you like what kind of accounting responsibilities do you think are very good for a remote like work setup?
Yeah, maybe before I answer that question, Jotham, just to set a little bit my perspective for the listeners. All of my points of view on remote versus hybrid versus in-person work are from a perspective of an individual who is an accountant and a finance professional. I do not know if my responses are applicable to salespeople, to people who do marketing, engineering, or really any other aspect of work within a company. I also would like to say that most of my experiences have been tied to the software as a service industry, so SaaS space. And if somebody works at a company that has a lot of machinery and a lot of inventory, maybe some of the answers and thoughts would work differently. But so my perspective is as an accountant, finance professional working at a SaaS company. From that perspective, majority of the accounting work, whether we're talking about journal entries, reconciliations, analysis of financial statements, all of that work is the same, regardless of whether you're performing it in person or remotely. You still need to have a preparer who is going to dive into the details and do a good job of figuring out what the answer is for a particular problem. You still need to have a reviewer who is going to go with equal passion at the problem and assess whether the preparer has done a good job. And then once they have alignment, the journal entry or the work that they're doing is going to be posted to financial statements or memorized in a memo or whatever it may be. But that work needs to be done is the same regardless of our general setup. I see the choice between hybrid work, remote work, or in-person work as a circumstance that is chosen for us, usually by a CEO, the executive leadership team, the board, or whoever at the particular company is in charge of making that decision. And we need to perform under those circumstances, whatever chosen circumstances are. It's very similar to a soccer player who needs to perform in rain, in sunshine, heat, windy conditions, snow. It doesn't matter. The environment is what it is. And somebody will prefer to play in rain. Somebody else will prefer to play in heat. But in any case, the requirement is to perform, to do as good of a job as we can. And job is doable and can be accomplished in both situations.
Yeah.
I think people can be a little bit more passionate about speaking in favor of one type of work or another. but I would say that there's pros and cons to almost everything. For example, when it comes to working on journal entries or reconciliations and you have a preparer and a reviewer, people will say, well, isn't it so nice to be in office and be able to go to the desk of your colleague and just ask the question versus using some form of technology to sync on a particular issue? I would say, yeah, sure, that is very nice. It's very, very nice. But I would ask whether that action is productive or counterproductive and for whom. So if I'm in the office and I'm working on a journal entry, I walk over to my colleague because I need their help to help me figure out how to answer a particular question. I will interrupt their work. At that moment, they will be potentially deep into reading a memo, writing their own stuff, whatever it may be. I'm going to interrupt them. They will help me get the answer, which will be very productive for me, but it will be counterproductive for them, most likely, because they've been zoomed out of their work and in order to help me do my thing. So for us as a company and for us as a team, was that action productive or not productive? I don't know. It's very debatable. And so there's different ways to look at this, but I would say like the general work of an accountant in a SaaS company does not change regardless of where we're doing it.
I agree. And Senad, and this is again why you're such a great guest for this show. I think the way you spoke practically about the pros and cons, and maybe not be able to like see it very explicitly, right? Like in a situation where you're interrupting maybe a preparer and they're digging deep into like a revenue contract, someone coming in and asking a quick question is beneficial for that person, but not for the other. So yeah, I don't think it's a binary, like one way is infinitely more productive than the other. There's like a netting involved, right? And I think in each situation, you kind of have to see whether the net speaks to, more effective environment remote versus hybrid or in person. And I think that math just has to be done, of course, not in a very granular way, but I think it's different depending on the situation, which is why I also appreciated you starting off with saying, hey, my experience has been in the accounting function, it's SaaS. And that calculation and that math we were just talking about could be so different for other functions, other industries. And I think it's fair for us to like acknowledge that. And I know because people are so passionate on both sides, it's easy for people to like cling on to one side as being right for everything and everyone. But I think the very practical, again, like response you gave, speaks to, I think, the reality of the situation. It's good in some ways, it's not good in others.
Totally agree.
Well, and so I want to maybe dig into your specific workplace right now. Like, what trends are you seeing? So, for accounting leaders that are listening to our podcast, what kind of new changes or trends are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah. So again, I believe that there are positives and negatives to working in any of the three setups that we are discussing here. But the companies that I work for, 1Password, is unique in that it has been remote from the beginning. So the company was founded in 2005. Depending on when you post this podcast out there, it should be about 19 years from the company founding to the moment when people are listening. And during that entire time, the company has been remote. There is a significant difference, I find, in how remote work feels at a company that has done it from the very beginning, and how it feels at companies that have transitioned to that either fully or partially during COVID. And that second part, I'm speaking very little from experience, more from conversations with my colleagues and friends that I have routinely. A company that has done it from the beginning has had a lot of time to think about the pros and cons, to think about what the strengths and weaknesses of this model are, and to understand how to approach work and how to approach interaction with employees. To give you a very, very practical example, 1Password is Toronto, Canada headquartered. That is East Coast, East time zone. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, Pacific time zone. Joining the company, because a lot of our people are on the East Coast, I was expecting to have some challenges adjusting to working East Coast hours, which would mean, some meetings would start 5 a.m. my time on the Pacific Coast. I've been at the company for 6 months now, and I've only had maybe 2 meetings that happened before 8 a.m. Pacific, which is 11 a.m. Eastern. And that's because the company has learned over time that its employees are going to be located in various different places. They're going to work from various different time zones. And there's just a general respect and understanding for that. So what happens is that the time from 8 a.m. Pacific to 2 p.m. Pacific, so 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, that time is packed with meetings. That's about 6 hours when a lot of cross-collaborative activity happens. Outside of that, very little. Outside of that, you have an opportunity to focus on work that you need to do individually. And that is something that's ingrained in culture. And I believe really, really helps people be effective and people be happy with their setup. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is companies that have moved to remote or hybrid work more recently, they tend to struggle with that concept. When you don't see people in person on a regular basis, trust can be a challenge for management because you're not really seeing. Some people will sometimes say, hey, but I don't see people. How do I know that they do work? And the way to solve for that is, number one, hiring practices need to be really strong. So you need to be hiring very good people who are passionate about the work that they are about to do. And as long as they're good people passionate about the work they're going to do, I think they're going to be self-motivated to help the company succeed and to help further advance their own careers. The other thing is understanding that people are productive at different parts of the day. Different people may be better at night or in the morning or middle of the day. And that is totally okay. And being remote actually allows the company to, yes, there will be a window of time where a lot of meetings are happening and there is less flexibility, but there'll be quite a few hours during the day when there is more flexibility. And that is definitely one of the advantages if trust component is there. That is something that is different and a little bit of an advantage for a company that's been doing this for a long period of time.
Well, and Senad, you mentioned the word trust 2 or 3 times in that remark, and of course, we know that word very well in the profession. It's pretty much tattooed from us since the day we started thinking about our CPA exams. But all kidding aside, like that's something I hadn't thought about too. And in my own hiring practices here at Gapify, in a world where there is hybrid or remote, I think trust becomes more important, right? Because once you start being skeptical about the level of trust you have with your teammates, then things probably spin more quickly out of control in a remote environment. Because obviously it's harder to look at someone eye to eye and kind of just establish kind of that physical rapport and trust. So you kind of have to like look for that in the hiring process early on. And I would be interested in hearing from my team now, recruiting team, like how has our evaluation of trust in candidates changed since we're for us at Gapify, we're hybrid. It'd be interesting to think about. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Senad.
Yeah, I mean, going back to me being an accountant in SaaS space, I think one of the advantages of our profession related to this topic is that majority of the work that we do is documented. It's documented in spreadsheets or documents or elsewhere. And I still believe, and I think we discussed in one of the previous podcasts, that a job of a person who is in the accounting field is to be detailed, is to be close to the detailed work and to really understand it. And so if regardless of which level you operate at within the company, if your intent is to operate at a pretty detailed level, whether that's through review of the work that's been done, reading the memos, looking at spreadsheets, whether it's through reperformance of some of the work, or just simply attendance of meetings where your teams are discussing different questions and topics, if you're going to operate that way, then that's going to solve for a lot of trust concerns because you will see work being done, you will understand it, and you will be able to be a good judge of whether that work is done at a high quality, medium quality, or low quality level. So I think other than the natural trust, I think closeness to the detail and involvement with the team is a very important part of that solution.
So it goes beyond just like the output and like documents and journal entries, but there's the understanding and being able to regurgitate the knowledge that you're acquiring is another way of demonstrating like production.
Absolutely, and I would argue that as an accountant, you have a responsibility to know that detail regardless of the environment. So it's not just something you need to solve for because you work in a remote place. I think you should be solving for that regardless. Going back to your question about hiring, though, and going back to everything having a positive and a negative as well, in-person hiring is fantastic in that you get to shake hands, you get to sit across the table from each other, you can feel each other's dynamic. Like, for example, when I interview people in person, I like to walk around the room a little bit just because it's just my personality comes through, my passion for the work we do comes through in very obvious way. And then people can decide if they like that or don't like that. But that is there is an additional input, an additional piece of information that people gain from seeing you in person that does not exist in remote environment hiring. But remote environment hiring, on the other side, provides ability to hire within the entire country. And in our case, it's Canada and US primarily. That is a huge talent pool of individuals who would like to join an environment like that. And so starting with a high, very big pool, I think you always have a good chance, no matter what the role is, to hire a really, really good, high-performing individual. And then if you bring them in and you set them up for success through different software tools that the company has determined over time are good to help remote work, if you provide them with trust that they probably crave, especially if they're a high-performing individual, and then if you work collaboratively as much as possible so that you stay close to detail, I think you cover off for a lot of those risks.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to your point about the positives and the downsides to all of these different things. So just to summarize some of your points, earlier we talked about just the ability for a preparer to stay focused on reviewing that revenue contract. That's a big plus in productivity. You just mentioned the ability to open up the talent pool to so many geographies by offering remote work is another positive and benefit of that setup. But then you also touched on, and this is very true with me and with my customer relationships, Senad. So I have really great connections with customers when I'm meeting with them live. It's just in my personality, right? Like I get more excited and bubbly in person than I do with Zoom, and not everyone is like that. So I'm going to qualify again. Like, this works for me, but doesn't work for everyone. That relationship is a positive for me and seeing people in person, whether it's customers, employees. So yeah, I mean, I really like the approach we're taking with this episode, which is just recognizing that it's not, again, like it's not 100% argument one way or the other.
People who worked with me in person in past will probably remember I'm a big fan of high five when something good, something amazing happens. Like you solve a problem together, you figure something out. A very very passionate high five. It's so good, and it feels so good, and it builds camaraderie. I don't know. I just love it. Something about it I really, really like. And that's not something that I can get in a company that works fully remotely. On the other side, though, the company works fully remotely. I do have ability most days to walk away from work around 5 p.m., spend time with my kids. I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, all the way until they go to bed. And then I can log on at night in the evening and work as much as I need and make up for the time that otherwise would be spent either commuting or would be spent working a little bit longer in the office. So there's that flexibility. So it's just pros and cons, and there's just no right answer here. Both models, or all three models, can be successful. They can all work well as long as people are thoughtful about how they design their working spaces and how they approach work. The only thing I disagree with is when people say, "Oh, it's not possible to get work done in one of the three ways." And for an accountant in a SaaS industry, that is a false statement. I don't know which one is better. That will depend on a person. But the statement that work is not possible to happen in one of the three areas, or that it's necessarily worse in one of the three approaches, I just think that statement is false.
I agree with you 100%. And it's an attitude I take when I watch like a CNBC segment on studies that say, this approach is better than another. It's just so nuanced. And so as we wrap up, Sanad, like I have one takeaway, and I'm going to ask for yours too as we wrap up. Like for me, the takeaway is just being thoughtful. You pointed this out, and strategic about like what are the main positives you're looking for, whatever decision you make for your company or your team. And I think that's great advice for accounting leaders. Like be intentional Like, what are you trying to maximize? Is it relationships? Is it productivity? Is it a mix? But yeah, I'd love to hear your parting advice for accounting leaders as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would also add that it is great when the company as a whole is very clear on what it is doing, which of the three approaches it is prioritizing, why, and how. And I would say that we've spent generations working in person, and I think we know how to do that pretty well. Companies that have been set up to be remote for a very long time also know how to do that well. Companies that are going through transition one way or the other will have some bumpy times, will have a little bit of a challenge figuring out how to best position themselves for effective work. I think that's okay. And I think that it is important that those companies just give themselves enough thinking space to keep improving until they find the model that works best for them. I think it's not realistic to expect that you can switch overnight or even over a course of a year or two. It takes a little bit of time to find the right balance between these different pros and cons that we talked about. So patience and alignment cross-functionally in companies, I think, is also an important takeaway that will help transition for those who are making it smoother.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of setting expectations. And you pointed out earlier that this change is not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. It's such a huge decision for any team or company. And so just going into it knowing, that there's alignment that's required. There's some level of like transition and change management that's happened, to use a software term. I think going into it with that in mind, I think is incredibly important. So not another great episode on just the people side of accounting, the non-number side of accounting. I'm sure we can come up with more topics over time, but I think this has been very beneficial for our audience. And I thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Jotham. You ask excellent questions. Pleasure to speak with you as always, and hope to see you again.
I'm a good reviewer.
I'll be the preparer anytime.
Thanks for stopping by. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you want more information, please check us out at gapify.com, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.